Welcome, this is Scientists Live. I'm Dr. John Wible, and I'm curator of mammals at the Carnegie Museum of Natural History in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Our mammal collection, which you can see part of it behind me, has about 130,000 specimens from all over the world. Now, I've forgotten where I was, but I'm going to keep going. Anyway, this is the problem with going live. Each of those specimens has a global and temporal context, that is a time and place, that allows researchers, be they in person or virtual visitors, to address a broad array of scientific topics about the biology, natural history, and evolution of mammals. My own area of research is in the tree of life of mammals, understanding how mammals evolve to be what they are today and live where they do. There are 5,500 species of mammals alive on Earth today. There are nearly twice as many bird species and at least 65 times as many species of beetles. So mammals really only represent a very small part of Earth's biodiversity. Yet, because humans are mammals, and because most of our pets are mammals, we have a particular fascination with mammals. All mammals have certain features that distinguish them from other vertebrates, that is, animals that have backbones. For one, we all have hair, at least at some point in our life. Now, some more than others have hair. Also, female mammals produce milk, by which they nourish their young. Now, for me today, what we're going to largely focus on is the fact that some mammals, actually most mammals, have a very complex set of teeth, or dentition, like this tiger here. So in the front, we have incisors, canines, premolars, and molars. This comes in two generations or sets during the life of the animal. There's a baby or deciduous set, and there is an adult or permanent set. Now, this is a very different strategy than what most other vertebrates that have teeth do, like, for example, this shark. So in the shark, there is a continuous replacement of teeth. So at each tooth position, there are a series of teeth that are ready and waiting to move in as a tooth is lost. This goes on during the life of the animal. Now, the mammal pattern is very important for getting a very precise fit between the upper and lower teeth so that you can grind up or masticate your food. The fact that we're able to do this is very important because it makes our digestion more efficient, which is in turn important because we can get more energy out of the food that we eat, which is important for maintaining our warm-blooded lifestyle. Now, one thing that's going to come up a little bit later that I want you to realize has to do with something about the mammal skull in general. We can think of it as being built on two parts. There's a face or front part, which includes the teeth and this structure here that you call the hard palate. And then there's a back half or back part that encloses the brain case. So I'll have more to say about that as we get going here. Okay. Now, although mammals have invested a lot of energy in making these two generations of teeth, there are some exceptions to this. Some mammals actually reduce the number of teeth, or they make them more simple, and then on very rare occasions, there are those mammals that actually don't have any teeth at all. This has been acquired independently in 4 different lineages of living mammals. So I'm going to go over those different occurrences today. The first one, which we don't have room to show you here, is actually the large filter-feeding whales, like the blue whale. So they don't have any teeth in their mouth. They have these comb-like structures that are made out of keratin, which is the same stuff that's your fingernails and toenails is made of. And they act as sieves to, as water is brought into the mouth, capture food particles that are then swallowed. Those comb-like structures are called baleen, and hence blue whales are called baleen whales. The other 3 instances of toothless lineages of mammals are all dedicated social insect feeders. So they feed exclusively on ants and termites, which live in large colonies and therefore represent great restaurants of choices for those animals to eat. So we're going to go over those three different occurrences, but I'm reminded that I have to tell you about some of the problems with eating social insects. So there's some challenges here. So first of all, social insects are really small. So you have to eat a lot of them to get enough nutrition. Secondly, the social insects have very hard outer shells called an exoskeleton that you have to somehow break down to get the good stuff on the inside. And remember, we don't have any teeth in these animals to do that, so we have to figure out some other way that we're going to do that. And thirdly, the social insects have a very nasty disposition, and they bite. And moreover, they are filled with formic acid, which in large concentrations is a corrosive. Okay, so the first of our three lineages of social insect feeding toothless mammals is represented by this giant anteater here. This is a form from Central and South America. It is a ground-dwelling form. It has three cousins that live in the trees. So they are called arboreal mammals because they live in the trees. So the feeding strategy of this animal is that, first of all, it has these incredibly sharp claws on its forelimbs. It uses those claws to dig into a nest, and then it has an incredibly long tongue inside of this head here that it sticks into the nest. The tongue has got a very sticky saliva on it. The ants stick to the saliva, and then they're swallowed back in. Now, as you can see, this animal is all nose. It's got these tiny little eyes, which means its eyesight is not particularly good. But this long nose is in part to hold an incredibly long tongue. This animal has a tongue that is 2 feet long. I'll repeat that, 2 feet long. So you got to fit it into here. And the other thing why it has such a long nose is because it's a very smell-oriented animal. It has a heightened sense of what we call olfaction, the sense of smell. So it finds its prey by doing that. Okay, so now we're going to look at the skull of this animal, which fits in the head like this. So not surprisingly, because we have a long pointy head, we're going to have a long pointy skull. And I remind you of our tiger. So if you remember our tiger, we've got a palate that only runs about the first half of the skull. In contrast, in the giant anteater, the palate runs the entire length of the ventral skull base. This is really important because the palate in these animals, remember there's no teeth here, and by the way, that's where that little tiny eye would fit, right here. So this palate is the first point in the digestive process. So the ants that are stuck to the tongue are pulled back into the mouth, and they're crushed on the palate. This starts to break down the exoskeleton of the ants and termites that it's feeding on. Then the ants are swallowed. They move down from the esophagus into the stomach, which is the next major part where our digestive process is going to go on. Now, in most mammals, the stomach produces acid that is used to break down the food. Not in the giant anteater. The giant anteater actually recycles the formic acid that's inside of its food source. So it doesn't have a stomach that produces acid. The other thing about its stomach, which is unusual and important for this digestive process, is that it's covered with an incredibly thick layer on the inside that has lots of ridges on it. So you can imagine as the stomach is working, that further works to break down the exoskeletons of its food source. Then the last thing that's really important in the stomach process is that when the anteater is feeding, it invariably brings into the mouth and into the stomach dirt and grit along with the ants. And the dirt and grit inside the stomach further works to break down those foodstuffs. Some birds and dinosaurs do a similar process where they ingest either small stones or, in the case of large dinosaurs, bigger stones to break down food inside the digestive tract. Okay, so there's the skull of the giant anteater, which honestly is one of the weirdest mammal skulls I've ever seen. But wait till you see this. This is the lower jaw here. In fact, I should say this is the two halves of the lower jaw that would go together like this. Now, most mammals, the two halves of the lower jaws come together to form a single bone called a mandible, and it works as a unit. On the other hand, in the giant anteater, they're only very loosely attached at the front, and the anteater has an incredibly weird mechanism for opening its jaw. So for most of us, jaw opening is a very simple process. You essentially relax the muscles that are holding the jaw in place, and you let gravity do its thing. So you just go like that, okay? Not the giant anteater. The giant anteater does something really weird. So you would think maybe an animal like this could have like an incredible gape like this. They don't. They have an amazingly small gape. So what happens is that rather than use gravity, they actually rotate the jaws out like that, which makes just enough of a gap to stick that tongue out. So it may help to do it like this. So if your jaw is sort of, the lower jaw is like this, and you go like that and rotate it out, you create a space. The tongue sticks out of that space. And by the way, that's really cool because then the ants can't crawl inside. There's not a lot of room for them to get in and bite you on the inside of your mouth. Okay, so we're doing this to get the tongue out, and these guys are masters at flicking their tongues. Movies have shown that they do this motion of moving their tongue in and out 3 times a second. The feeding strategy is not to stay at a nest very long, because remember, the prey is going to come and bite you. So they only stay for about a minute. They feed like crazy for a minute, continuously swallowing while they're feeding, and then they move on to the next nest. They can visit about 200 nests a day and consume around 30,000 ants in a day. Okay, so now we're going to move from our first example to our second example of toothless social insect feeding mammals. So those are these 3 specimens over here, which are called scaly anteaters, pangolins, or sometimes the pinecone mammal. So these animals are found in Africa and Asia. There are 4 species in each of those continents. They include both ground-dwelling and arboreal forms, those on the ground and that live in the tree. And in fact, one of these pangolins from West Africa, which is this beautiful specimen here, is appropriately called the long-tailed pangolin because it has the longest tail to body length ratio of any mammal that there is. So here's the length of the body, like that, and the rest of this animal is entirely tail after that. Now, you can imagine that life in the trees with this animal, it actually uses this tail as a 5th limb. It's got a little pad at the end of it, like the pads on your finger, and it can hang from a branch. So this is what we call a prehensile tail. Now, the pangolins have a very similar feeding strategy to our giant anteater. They have incredibly large claws at the front that they use to dig into a nest. They have a very long, sticky tongue, as has been reconstructed in this taxidermy mount here. And they ingest dirt and grit into their stomach to help break down the grit. The most unusual feature, of course, of these scaly anteaters are these scales that are found all over the body except on the undersurface. So they have a soft underbelly. These scales are made from the same material as your fingernails again, just like the baleen in the whales that I talked about earlier. Unfortunately for the pangolin, the scales are not necessarily a good thing for them, because this is why pangolins today are the most heavily illegally trafficked animals on the planet. The scales are thought to have medicinal powers in traditional African and Asian medicines. So the animals are collected for these scales. Also, they're good eating according to those same populations. So they eat them and then they use the scales in medicine. The third Saturday of February is World Pangolin Day. We missed it already because we're now in March, but next year we should be celebrating World Pangolin Day because this day was instituted by conservation groups to try to inform the public of the terrible crisis that is impending for the future of these amazing animals. Okay, now our third instance of mammals that have become dedicated social insect feeders is this very odd mammal looking over here. So this one is from the continent of Australia. This is actually called a spiny anteater or an echidna. Unlike these other mammals that we've looked at today, which are placental mammals, like humans are, this one is a monotreme. So alongside the duck-billed platypus, the echidna and the platypus are the two kinds of monotremes, which are the egg-laying mammals. They're thought to be the most primitive of the mammals because they've retained egg-laying as their mode of reproductive biology. Now the echidna also has a very similar strategy for feeding as does the pangolins and the giant anteater over here. It has a long snout, it's got big claws at the front to dig into nests. One of the differences, which I can't show you here, is actually on the inside of the mouth, where rather than, again, no teeth, remember, but what it does have is it has little spines of keratin, both on the upper and lower part of the palate and the floor of the mouth, that serve to, again, grind up those exoskeletons before they're ingested down into the esophagus. Now, obviously the most unusual feature on this animal, ouch, is these terribly sharp spines that luckily are not on the ventral surface of the animal, so I can pick it up and hold it this way. Now, unlike a porcupine, these spines are not shed when they're attacked by somebody. They're in there all the time. These are actually modified hairs and really, really sharp. Okay? So what's happened over the course of evolutionary history is that social insects represented a food source that was exploited by a variety of different mammals, not just the ones that are here. These are the ones that have lost their teeth. So it's only these three lineages in South America, Africa and Asia, and in Australia where we have gone the extreme route of losing teeth to become dedicated social insect feeders. Each of these acquisitions of this is an independent evolutionary event because these animals are in very different parts of the mammal tree of life. So all these similarities that we see between them in their feeding apparatus have been convergently or independently acquired during the course of evolutionary history. And it's these particular peculiarities that we saw with the spines and the scales and the long nose and tongue and extreme adaptations on this one that are the features that we use to distinguish them from each other today. And now I'm ready for questions. Are ants afraid of anteaters? Now that's a really interesting question. I think that what happens is that if you think about it, I don't think the ants are on the lookout for the anteaters or any of these other animals here, the pangolins or the echidna. But once they break into the nest, there's going to be an alarm call that goes out, and those ants are going to swarm because the integrity of the nest has been compromised by those large claws digging in there. So I don't think that the ants per se are afraid of them. because they don't necessarily see them as a threat until they break into the nest. So that's our first question. Does dirt stick to an anteater's tongue? Absolutely, that's an important part of the adaptation here, because remember, they have to ingest or swallow dirt and grit to help the digestive process move along. So yes, they have an incredibly sticky saliva, and not surprisingly, along with that sticky saliva, they have humongous salivary glands. So our salivary glands, which are in the floor of our mouth and up here on the side of our face, are not particularly large, but in an animal like this, they're humongous because they're continually producing saliva while they're feeding to keep that tongue to be very sticky. What got me interested in my job? Oh my goodness, that's actually a kind of a tough question. I didn't really come to my interests until kind of late in life. I was always interested in science, but I didn't really have a particular affinity for mammals or natural history until I was in college, when I took a class about primates and primate behavior. And I learned about these people that were living with baboons and living with chimps in Africa. And that's when I decided that that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to go to Africa and live with animals and discover how they lived and how they got to be the way they are. I haven't really done that, though, because I got bogged down in anatomical and morphological details. Do toothless mammals have tooth-making genes that are not expressed? Now, there's a question that came from a very informed person. You know, I don't know the answer to that. I would assume that that has to be the case, but there's an area of research for somebody, maybe even the person that asked that question. What is the smallest mammal you have researched? Well, okay, so the smallest living mammal that I have researched is sort of like a little shrew that is probably about the size of that. But that's not the smallest mammal that ever lived. That's the smallest living mammal. There was a mammal that lived during the Jurassic, so about 150 million years ago, that was known as the paperclip mammal because it was the length of a paperclip. So that's even smaller than the living shrew that I mentioned. So that's the smallest mammal that's been found so far, and I have actually spent some time looking at that mammal, so I can say I researched it. Do anteaters eat anything besides ants? That's actually another really good question. Although all of these animals I think of them as being dedicated social insect feeders, meaning that's their primary food source, they do eat other things. It's hard to imagine, but this animal actually does eat some fruit in its diet. So obviously with these kind of mechanisms for opening and closing the mouth and chewing, it doesn't chew the fruit. It laps it up with its tongue, so it waits till it falls to the ground, because again, it's not a tree climber. It falls to the ground, and while it's on the ground and probably rotting, it laps it up with that tongue. So they do eat fruit. In fact, these are kept in zoos. I don't know if anybody out there has had the opportunity to see them in a zoo. I have. They're just amazing animals. In the zoos, they're fed a mixture of eggs, water, mealworms, and ground beef. So that's, if you want to make ants at home, eggs, water, mealworms, and ground beef. These other guys also do eat some things like larvae of beetles and things like that. But again, their primary source is those social insects. How do you define one species from another? Well, there are many kinds of different definitions for how we distinguish species from each other. Most of them have to do with what we call reproductive viability. So if the animals mate do they produce viable offsprings? So luckily, when this mates with another giant anteater, it produces a viable offspring. If it mates with one of its arboreal cousins that we think of as a different species, it will not produce viable offsprings. So there's a very standard, this reproductive viability definition for species, and I'm sticking to that one right now. Would an anteater make friends with other mammals? You know, I think they're kind of oblivious to other mammals except those that are trying to eat them. So I don't think we're really making friends. I think we're trying to avoid other mammals because you can imagine that because they don't have any teeth. So here's our tiger with this big set of teeth here, and this is how it both defends itself and it finds its food. This guy, how's he going to defend himself? With that tongue? I mean, I guess he could whiplash the tongue and get people. Actually, he does have one major thing about protection that we haven't really talked about, and that is we'd have to pan the camera, so we're not going to do that. The end of this animal over here has an incredibly, oh, we're going to do it. Okay, we're going to pan over here and show you this tail. This is this animal's lethal weapon, is that tail. It can swish that around and do some damage. The other thing I should mention are these claws on the forelimb, because not only are they good for digging into nests to get food, they're also good for defense. I did read an anecdote that using those claws, there was a juvenile giant anteater that was caught and went like that and ripped through a thick pair of work boots with one swipe of its foreleg. There also are reports that I discovered of a giant anteater killing a human. There were 2 instances of that with those giant claws. So obviously the animal was cornered, didn't know what else to do, so it lashed out and did some damage. So I hope that answers somebody's question. What makes a mammal a mammal? Well, I talked about that some at the beginning. Let me repeat that in case I went too fast. What makes a mammal a mammal? We talked about fur. We talked about producing milk. We talked about teeth, which don't work all the time. The major feature of the skeleton that makes a mammal happens to be something way inside here. We have 3 middle ear ossicles, a malleus, an incus, and a stapes, sometimes known as the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup. Other vertebrates have only one of those bones. They have only the stirrup part of it. So that's a unique osteological feature of mammals. Another one is the way that we have our jaw joint just between this bone here and the skull base. It fits like that. In other vertebrates, the jaw joint is a much more complicated entity and includes more bones in it. How do toothless mammals combat chemical attacks from insects? Okay, so part of the mechanism, at least for these guys, is that they have these scales, and they have very dense outer skin. Actually, all of them have very thick outer skin, and they must build up an immunity to the toxins that are inside those things. But again, formic acid is only bad in high concentrations. Formic acid in small concentration actually appears in some of the foods that we eat. So it's not necessarily until it gets into large concentrations. But largely the mechanism happens to do with this outer covering on the body as part of the protection. And I guess we don't have any more questions. So I will say goodbye from Scientists Live at the Carnegie Museum. Bye-bye.